Hello everyone, and welcome to our 5th bite-sized learning module we're filming as part of our Modern Slavery Impact Initiative. These are a series of conversations we're having with leading experts throughout Australia, unpacking key modern slavery risk issues for Australian businesses. And this series has been made possible by the support of the Australian Government through the National Action Plan to Combat Modern Slavery. My name is Caskey, and I look after the human rights programming at the UN Global Compact Network in Australia. And it's my privilege today to be joined by Dr Meg Brodie, our partner in charge at KPMG Banarra Human Rights and Social Impact Services, and also Global Head of the KPMG Business and Human Rights Network. Welcome, Meg.
Thank you, Chris.
So today we are looking at grievance mechanisms as contemplated in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. I suppose, Meg, to kick us off, can you just let us know what is a grievance mechanism and why do companies need them?
It's exactly where we need to start, and I think maybe even one step further back, which is what is a grievance. So what we're really fundamentally talking about is when people have a concern, an issue, or there's an incident that they need to bring to the attention of an organisation in order to have that issue resolved. And a grievance mechanism is either a formal or an informal channel that allows that person to raise that issue. When we think about grievance mechanisms, it happens in the context of this question of the human right to an effective remedy. And that's one of the fundamental things, and the reason I'm so delighted that we're having this conversation is that we often get stuck and we stop with systems and controls for managing risk, and we forget that a really critical component of our understanding of that risk, and in this instance modern slavery risk, is being able to hear about the concerns of affected stakeholders. And that's affected rights holders, people who are being impacted by potential harm. And grievance mechanisms, depending on the way in which they're set up, provide an opportunity for that avenue to be accessible.
One of the most common pieces of feedback that we get for businesses that have gone through the process to set up a grievance mechanism, they've got the hotlines or what have you in place, but they say actually nobody's used it. We haven't had any notifications. Why do you think that is?
Whistleblowing hotlines are not sufficient. Look, I think in terms of the way that companies have started to approach this question, we need to step back to a couple of things here. The first is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that helps us to understand that there are a number of different avenues that affected rights holders should be able to make their concerns known. So the first is the government's not off the hook here. So there's still the state-based duty to protect human rights, and that state-based duty incorporated within it says governments, you've got to make sure that affected stakeholders have the ability to bring a complaint forward. And there's a whole range of judicial mechanisms, use of the courts, formal statutory authorities that can drive that, along with laws that require private actors or businesses to take particular steps. And a component of that is thinking about collective action. So the way that workers can come together to bring forward a complaint. But secondly, operational level grievance mechanisms, because not just workers that are affected, of course. And when we use that terminology, an operational level grievance mechanism, if we cut away the lingo there, what we're really talking about are those avenues that I referred to before. Some are really informal and some are much more formal. Some are closely in the control of a business. They've set them up and some are not. And so back to your fundamental question, is why are people not raising their grievances? The first thing might be the way that mechanism is set up. So the UNGPs are really helpful here. They provide a set of criteria that let us understand what does it mean to set up an effective operational level grievance mechanism. Those criteria go to things like its legitimacy, its accessibility, how transparent it is, the predictable and equitable nature of it. Really importantly, it's also a source of continuous learning. And I think this is that moment where companies need to take a deep breath and go, complaints are good. What they enable us to see is a view into the experiences, either of the communities where that company is operating and working, the concerns and experiences of workers in the supply chain, or direct employees. Broader stakeholders like customers or clients can also be a really important part of that mix. And so when we think about grievance mechanisms as a source of continuous learning, that opens up a window into being able to understand issues better in order to be able to respond to them. And a critical and final criteria sitting there with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and Principle 31 is that fundamentally it's based on engagement and dialogue. So the way that you go setting up mechanisms is fit for purpose. It's fit for purpose for those rights holders. And just to close out that thought, it's not just about the mechanism itself. It never is. Mechanisms exist in a context. And the dialogue that I know that Australian businesses and businesses globally are increasingly having is, what does it mean for someone to feel safe to come forward? What does that culture look like? What's the tone from the top? What's leadership saying in terms of welcoming grievances, welcoming the coming forward of those issues in order to be able to say, hey, here's some things that we can collectively address.
Well, that's extremely interesting. And one of the points that you just touched on is the nature of an informal channel. If you're a business, how do you think you can set yourself up to have grievances raised through informal channels? Like, what should we be telling employees to actually look out for?
Capability building of those employees. I think it's a really great point. So the first thing is that people often will raise a concern obliquely. So what I mean by that is it can be deeply confronting to come forward and say, I've had this experience. We're not talking about gripes here. We're not talking about the whinges around the corner. We're talking about fundamental violations of human rights. And in the modern slavery space, we're talking about the most egregious of violations in the labour exploitation space. The people that are experiencing those types of exploitations are deeply vulnerable. They often have insecure work. There's some recent research that's come out reconfirming what we know, which is if you're a migrant worker, you have work insecurity, the likelihood of you coming forward and feeling safe enough to describe the experiences that you're going through is pretty limited. So in that context, understanding here's someone who's trying to let me know something. Here is a flag. And so that capability building of employees, not just senior managers, although that's important, for the workforce to understand this is a flag and this is something, someone is trying to raise a grievance with me at this juncture. That becomes really important. I think the additional component to informal mechanisms is the clarity around reporting pathways. So we're doing a piece of work at the moment where we're looking at the cultural appropriateness of reporting pathways. And that's an important component to saying, not just is it accessible, predictable, equitable, transparent, and legitimate, we're really fundamentally asking the question about design. Has this been designed in a way that people are able to come forward, not just through the whistleblowing hotline, important, that's important to sit there, but through these other channels, these other reporting pathways. And that becomes an important part of creating a sense of dialogue and safety in a workforce.
So much I want to unpack there. But I just want to touch on really briefly, in setting those things up, you touched on earlier the nature of having them fit for purpose, and I think one of the most important ways you can do that is actually including workers in the design of the grievance mechanism. Is that something companies are doing, and how would you recommend they go about it?
Yeah, so I think there's a fraught relationship with worker voice still, and that fraught relationship is really about opening up a differentiated conversation with your workforce, and that's challenging. It's particularly challenging if you happen to be operating in a really complex industrial environment where those relationships are challenged. Unions have a really important part to play in bringing forward worker voice or providing representative examples of worker voice. And I think sometimes we're not necessarily, we're perhaps a bit too quick in the Australian context when we're talking about human rights to recognise that very critical and important role. But I mentioned at the start, Chris, that importance of dialogue in the way that workers are involved in the design. And so I'm doing a piece at the moment with the team where fundamentally the conversations that we're having with workers are informing the way that we go about designing what those particularly informal channels look like for workers to raise grievance. What would help you to feel safe? What is it about the current environment that is preventing that? So just as much as having nuts and bolts, systems and controls, human rights conversation, we're also having a much larger culture and leadership conversation. And I think as companies here in Australia are exercising that muscle more and more, whether it's through advisory boards, bringing specialists in to look and provide that independent view of what's happening, or alternatively, going back to ground zero, looking again at that, dusting off the human rights policy that might have been created without consultation, without a deeper understanding of salient human rights issues. All of those things are linked, and looking at that in the context of the way that you consider grievance mechanisms through to remediation of potential harm, that becomes part of that cycle.
One of the things that we were exploring in our latest publication, looking at modern slavery risk associated with maritime shipping, was all of the co-efficiencies that actually come along with having a really effective, accessible, predictable grievance mechanism. We know that there are, a lot of regulations coming into effect all over the world, a lot of different jurisdictions doing a lot of things. And Australian businesses have done a lot of work to actually put a lot of these processes in place. What do you think some of the co-efficiencies are, and sort of how do you see this playing out over the next few years? So
one of the things that we're finding is that companies that have started to lean into that process, and they're not many, I think that's important. You're sitting there thinking, listening to this and go, so we've got a whistleblowing hotline. People can make complaints to their manager. That's good starting point. That's where most organisations are up to at this juncture. But fundamentally, really the next step in that context is looking at the fit for purpose nature of those mechanisms to receive grievances that are quite significant. If you're working, whether you've got a third-party provider that's providing that hotline service, or you're starting to build some additional channels in the context of your business, you're really fundamentally setting your organisation up to receive those kinds of complaints. You might broaden out the base of languages in which people can make a grievance. You might be running differentiated training, so you don't just have effectively a human mailbox for the receipt of the grievance, but you have people with experience in trauma-informed interviewing. You have a clear process where people, when they do come forward, know what's going to happen. I'm going to say this, and I know what's going to happen as a result of my disclosure. And that's an important part of generating that sense of safety. And so there's some of the starting places. And then ultimately building out fundamentally to be clear about what your approach or your policy is with respect to remediation, which is making, that big word that gets tossed around and is rarely followed through on at this juncture, is fundamentally about putting someone back in the position that they were in prior to the harm that they experienced. And so starting to see your grievance mechanisms as an opportunity to prevent that harm, because you know it's happening, that's a trend, and then to do something about it where that harm has occurred, either in partnership or collaboration with other players, particularly if that's in a supply chain context, or alternatively reassessing the way that you're going about something. And that can speak right into the direct heart of core corporate strategy, not just the way that you approach human rights.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Meg. That's been extremely informative, and I think very important for companies as they're starting to assess their own grievance processes and where they've got to date. That's all we have time for in this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to know more about the UN Global Compact, you can visit us at unglobalcompact.org.au. I'll also mention some of the resources that we discussed in the description below. We have the KPMG listing and responding to modern slavery report. We also have the UN Global Compact effective grievance mechanism publications as well. Thank you so much, guys. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.